Welcome to episode 3, Loops. First of all, let's cover what a loop is. It's simply a bit of code that gets repeated. But there is two types of loops you need to know. For loops. This repeats a bit of code for each item in a list or each letter in a string. For example, in this list of 3 fruits, the code in the loop will be repeated 3 times. One for the string apple, then for the banana, and lastly for the mango. This can also be done with strings. For example, the loop will be repeated for every letter in hello. Let's use for loops. To write a for loop, use the word for, then a new variable name. This variable will represent each item in the list. Then, use the word in, then use the variable name for your list. Finally, a colon at the end. Then on the next line, write the code that you want to be repeated. In this case, the loop will run 3 times, and each time it will print the item that it's on. On the first loop, the item will be equal to apple, then the code inside the loop will run, and in this case we are just printing the item out, so apple will be printed out. On the next loop, the item will be equal to banana, so banana will be printed out. Finally, on the last loop, the item will be equal to mango, and therefore mango will be printed out. After the last loop, the loop is over and the program continues on the next line. I am doing the same thing, however I have used the variable name fruit as the name in the loop. As explained, each item in the loop has been printed out. Remember, make sure the code for the loop is indented. This means leaving a gap. If some code is not indented after a loop, then it will not be a part of the loop and will only run after the loop is finished. So in this case we have 2 print statements inside the loop and 1 print statement outside the loop. As shown, the last print statement is not in the loop and therefore is being printed after the loop is finished. If you had a big task that needed to be repeated a few times, you can use range. To use range, enter in a number. This number is how many times the code will be repeated. In this case, I will use 100, so my code will be repeated 100 times. Now let's cover the second type of loop, a while loop. This is easier to understand than a for loop. It simply repeats a bit of code until a certain condition is met. For example, the condition could be, if score is greater than 10. Once score is less than or equal to 10, the loop will end. Let's look into an example of a while loop. On the first line, I am creating a variable called score and setting it to an integer that is 0. To start the while loop, use the word while, then the condition in brackets, and a colon at the end. The condition that is used will need to be true for the loop to keep looping. For example, my condition is, if score is less than 10, and currently score is 0, so the condition is true. Now, for the code in the loop, make sure it is indented. In this case, I am doing 2 things in the loop. First printing the score, then setting the variable score equal to score plus 1. This bit is just adding 1 every time we loop. Make sure every bit of code that is in the loop is indented. So, on the first loop the score is 0. So 0 will be printed out, then score will be increased by 1. On the next loop, score will be 1, so 1 will be printed out, then score will be increased again. Then on the next loop, score will be 2, so 2 will be printed out, then increased by 1 again, making it equal to 3. This will keep repeating until the 10th loop. On the 10th loop, score will be equal to 9, then increased by 1 like usual. However, score is now 10, which does not meet the condition anymore. So the next loop cannot happen and the loop will end. Let's try it out. As shown, the loop has been looped 10 times and printed each number out. If you would like an infinite loop, then replace the condition with just true. As shown, each number is printed then increased by 1. And since there is no condition, it never stops. However, using the word break in a loop will completely end the loop from that point. As shown, only the first loop has happened. This is because the break has ended the loop in the first loop, so no other loop after can happen. Removing the break will allow the loop to loop infinitely and never reach the next line. We can also use breaks in for loops. In this case, we break after printing the first item, so only the first loop will happen. And without the break, the for loop will loop like normal. And that's it for episode 3. Make sure to keep playing around with both types of loops. See you in the next episode.